The next day, Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now, Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph, from Nazareth." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." When Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him, he said of him, "Here is truly an Israelite in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael asked him, "Where did you get to know me?" Jesus answered, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you." Nathanael replied, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Do you believe because I told you that I saw you under the fig tree? You will see greater things than these." And he said to him, "Very truly I tell you, you will see heaven opened, and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man." On the third day, there was a wedding in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." I often have to remind myself that when the Gospels were written, they were not divided into chapters and verses as we know them today. Chapter divisions were not added until the early 13th century, and verses were not added until the mid-16th. So, when these Gospels were written, they may not have been written with the expectation that readers would pause in the same places where we do today. For example, the story of Jesus' encounter with the disciple Nathanael at the end of the first chapter of the Gospel of John is immediately followed by the story of the wedding in Cana at the beginning of chapter 2. We tend to treat them as two distinct and unrelated stories. Why wouldn't we? It is marked right there in our Bibles. But what if there is meant to be a connection? The opening words of the wedding story, "on the third day," do make an explicit chronological connection. But is there really nothing more than that? The only thing that the story of the wedding says about the disciples is that they were there, without explaining why, and that they believed in Jesus because of what he did there. But there is no explicit connection to Nathanael. Or is there? The final chapter of the Gospel of John contains the only other reference in the whole Bible to this particular disciple. And there we are given one more piece of information. Nathanael was from Cana. Weddings were big local events, often the most significant of the year. Everyone from town would have been invited. But the populations of these places were pretty stable. Most people would have been related in some way or another to everyone else in Cana, which means that someone like Nathanael might just have been more than just a random guest, perhaps much more. So, I wanted to tell the story without that chapter break. Back in my 6th season, I did an episode based on the story of the encounter between Jesus and Nathanael. It was number 6.3, and I called it, "What Was Nathanael Doing Underneath the Fig Tree?" It has turned out, believe it or not, to be one of my most downloaded episodes. I guess I'm not the only one to have wondered about that question. If you have ever asked yourself that question, go listen to that episode. I ended up with the conclusion that it was saying that Nathanael was a bit of a radical, calling for the redistribution of land among the poor of Galilee. This episode will seek to ask another question that may have never occurred to you. This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 9.10. Whose wedding was it, anyway? When Philip first came to him, saying, "We have found him about whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus, son of Joseph, from Nazareth," Nathanael was already packing and getting ready to leave for his journey. But something in what Philip said caught his attention. No, it wasn't the part about finding someone who was the fulfillment of prophecy, or even the Son of God. Nathanael was struck by where Philip said that this fellow was from. You see, to most people, Nazareth, if they'd even heard of it, was just some no-place village off in the hill country of Galilee. But it turned out that Nazareth was a place that had been very much on Nathanael's mind for the last few days. Nathanael was from Cana. It was also a town in the hill country and a bit bigger than Nazareth, and it was in the same region. It was an easy 2-day journey from one place to the next. Faster if you took the direct route through the big city of Sepphoris. There had always been a bit of a rivalry between the two places, especially in the days when the inhabitants used to compete for jobs in Sepphoris. That had been Herod Antipas's capital back then, and he was carrying out extensive building projects there. Every day, men would line up in the marketplace of the city, hoping to get woodwork or stonework on the many construction sites. When the supervisors came around looking to hire people for the day, it had been customary to put down people who came from other towns and villages as a way to get people from your own town to the head of the line. For example, the men from Cana often dismissed those workers who had come in from Nazareth, saying, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Of course, the other villages had their comebacks. The jibe that was often directed at the men of Cana was that they were lazy, and that, if you hired them, they'd probably spend the whole day resting in the shade of a fig tree. So, in any case, the name of Nazareth certainly meant a great deal more to Nathanael than it would have to most people. But that was not the only reason why he reacted when Philip spoke of this Jesus. Nazareth was also a name that he had just heard the other day when he received a message from his parents back home. They had sent to tell him that they had finally arranged a suitable marriage for him. She was a nice girl, they said, from the neighboring village called Nazareth. When he received that news, Nathanael couldn't help it. The first thought that came to his mind was, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" But he knew that that was uncharitable. His parents knew him well, and he had little doubt that they would choose an excellent wife for him. He simply sent back the message that he would return home for the wedding as soon as possible. But imagine his surprise when, the very next day, Philip came to him to talk about someone else from the very same place. Someone for whom Philip claimed some extraordinary things. If the same old jibe came unbidden to his lips as an immediate response, that didn't really surprise Nathanael. Of course, Philip had no idea what his friend was talking about, and looked very puzzled. But, of course, Nathanael just laughed at that, and told Philip that, sure, he would meet this so-called Messiah and Son of God from Nazareth of his, and that Philip should tell this Jesus what he had said about Nazareth, and see how he reacted. Philip did as Nathanael had said. He was completely mystified when Jesus burst out laughing at what Nathanael had told him to say. But Jesus didn't explain. He just said to Philip, "I'd be happy to meet this friend of yours from Cana. Let's go see him." "I never said he was from Cana," Philip replied. But then he just shrugged, and the two men went off together. So it was that when they were just approaching the place where Nathanael was staying, just when they could see him from a distance, Jesus called out, saying, "Here is truly an Israelite, in whom there is no deceit." As they drew nearer, Nathanael asked him, "Do you think you know me? Where did you get to know me?" And of course, when Jesus answered and said, "I saw you under the fig tree before Philip called you," Nathanael burst out laughing, and Jesus with him. Well, Philip just looked on puzzled. But Nathanael didn't just laugh. What Jesus had said, and especially the way he said it, made him ponder. Especially because Jesus had called him an Israelite, a word rarely used in those days. It made him wonder if Jesus really did know more about him than just where he was from. Maybe he knew about how, when he was younger, Nathanael had been bold to advocate for the ancient promise of God that every Israelite should sit under their own vines and under their own fig trees, and no one should make them afraid. At a time when too many people were losing their traditional lands and farms because of Herod's policies, Nathanael had insisted that every Israelite should be able to have their own fig tree to sit under. Nathanael had since become much more jaded about such things. As he saw the fortunes of his friends and neighbors continue to decline, he had begun to lose hope in that ancient vision. He had left Cana, and the hope of ever establishing his own family on land that belonged to him. But there was something in this Jesus, and the way that he spoke about a man and his fig tree, that revitalized that sense of possibility in Nathanael. Could it be that Philip was actually on to something with this Jesus fellow? Nathanael and Jesus spoke for quite a while that afternoon. By the end of the time, Nathanael was quite convinced that this man was indeed worth following. But there was one thing that was still very much on his mind, and he felt that he had to speak to Jesus about it. He told of the marriage that his parents had arranged, and how they were expecting him to return home to celebrate it. "Wait a second," Jesus interrupted him. "Are you the man from Cana who is supposed to marry Abigail of Nazareth? I heard of those negotiations even before I left. She is a kinswoman of my mother." "Is that so?" Nathanael replied joyfully. "Well, that will practically make us cousins. And if that is the case, then you absolutely must come to the wedding celebration. You and all your friends." "You know what?" Jesus replied. "I'm always up for a good celebration. And I wouldn't be surprised if my mother will be there too. Chances are that Abigail chose her to be one of her companions." And so now you know how it came to pass that Jesus, who had been wandering all over Judea, Perea, and along the shores of the Sea of Galilee, suddenly found himself, on the third day, back in his old stomping grounds in a town not too far from home, and how his mother came to be there as well. He was there to support and bless a new friend from Cana, as well as an old friend from his old town. What he wasn't there for was to launch anything in any public way. He didn't feel as if the time for that had come yet. But circumstances have a way of disrupting even the best laid plans. Nobody planned for the wine to run out. If anything, it was a result of the hard economic times the region was facing. The family had simply not been able to lay up much extra for the event. Perhaps it would have been all right, though, if a number of unexpected guests hadn't shown up, including Simon Peter, Andrew, and Philip from far-off Bethsaida, as well as that fellow Jesus, who no one from Nazareth had heard from in months. But they were apparently new friends of the groom, and they were certainly not going to be turned away. Nathanael's family was mortified, of course, when the wine ran out. Who could blame them if one of them grumbled about the matter to one of the bride's matron companions? What she did as a result, well, that's the start of a whole other story. But the main concern, as far as Jesus was concerned, was that the wedding of his friend was celebrated joyfully and in an abundance that reflected the promise of the kingdom of God that he would have loved to tell you more about. When the Gospel of John was written, it didn't have any chapters or verses. It also didn't have any punctuation or even any spaces between the words. All of that came later. And it was not just something that made it easier to read and to share references with other people. It was an act of interpretation that has affected our understanding of the book ever since. You might feel that my speculation about how we might read the story of the wedding at Cana differently, without the division, to be a bit wild. That's fine. But let me ask you, whose wedding do you think it was? That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Thanks for listening. Share the word by telling somebody else about this podcast. The theme music for the podcast is Ada by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was Du und Ich, instrumental, by Sasha End. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and at filmmusic.io, respectively. You can contact me on Bluesky at Retelling the Bible and on the Facebook page, Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks as always to my Patreon supporters. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to join them in supporting this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.